Shalom, shalom. I'm Rabbi Yehuda, and today I'd like to talk to you about the Talmud. For many of you out there who don't know what Talmud is an embodiment of works. Actually, it's a voluminous work that was finished and completed around the 5th century CE. It actually discussed what is called oral law. The oral law is known as Torah shebe'al peh, meaning it is the Torah that was given by mouth. All right. So, for a lot of you out there, you're like, what is Torah that's given by mouth? I mean, when you think about it, Torah, before it was written, it was given by mouth. It was given by the mouth of the Most High. But in this context, because context means everything, in this context, it means that it is the Torah that was passed down by the judges of Israel. You see, in the Torah, you have to understand that the Most High gave the commandments to the judges of Israel to come up with law whenever the Torah commandments were not explicit enough. And we saw this during the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, that people argued and they debated the commandments. And even during Moshe's time, he had to quell many of the issues when it came down to commandments. Now, if this happened during Moshe Rabbeinu's time, you can imagine what happens afterward. Eventually, the high court was called the Sanhedrin. The great Sanhedrin were the judges of Israel, or the elders, that quell these issues. These elders later were called rabbis. And we see by the second temple period, about 2,000 years ago, and a little prior, the great Sanhedrin at that time, or the courts of Ezra, these great men, these great judges, were called rabbis. Now, please don't get confused with those who are called rabbis today. These people actually had an authentic form of smicha, or smukim, which is plural for smicha. They actually were successors from the time of Moshe and from Yehoshua ben Nun, and you see was posted by the Mishnah Torah all the way down to we had the last court, the last rabbi, the true rabbis. What we have as rabbis today are called hediotos, which are common people who have a certain knowledge base, understanding, or should have a basic understanding of Torah and the halacha to help guide people in the path of Torah and to serving Hashem. So today's rabbis, including myself, are what's called a pseudo smicha. All right. So even the greatest rabbis that we see, who are of high caliber, that people regard as high caliber. Some even have created the term Gadol Hador, means the great one of the generation. All right, these people today are clergymen in the best and basic sense that I can give to you. They do not have the smicha, all right, and they are not authorized to make new laws. So, whereas the judges of Israel were authorized by the Most High and Moshe Rabbeinu to make laws. Now, they didn't make laws or create laws in addition to the Torah. In other words, they didn't add to the Torah. They created what's called, we call rabbinical laws or judicial laws. They were laws that Moshe said we must carry. We should not go to the right or to the left of their judgment. And their ruling were so serious, or it is so serious, because we still have their rulings, which we call halacha, which I will explain later. But their rulings are so serious that the Most High even said it's tantamount to the death penalty if we do not follow their rulings. And this is the reason why their rulings are called rabbinical rulings. So many people may object to some of the rulings that were given in the Sanhedrin about how to follow the Torah, and by saying, hey, they added to the Torah. And many of these objections are actually from misunderstandings. It's based on a type of ignorance. You know, there's an old saying, context means everything. If you don't have the context of what they're saying, it's like going to a law library, or a library of law, I should say, and going and pulling out an excerpt from case law and trying to build a whole case from that excerpt. It's impossible. Therefore, in order to understand Talmud, and what it embodies, all right, you have to understand the context and the whole premise behind what is being discussed. So if I heard things being said like, oh, they said it's okay for a Jew to kill a Gentile and they don't require the death penalty. You have to understand the context behind these objections. And we will be covering these objections of the Talmud. So I guess this is going to be a series from this point on. So what are these laws called? We call it halakha. The reason why they call it halakha comes from the word holech. Holech means walk, literally walking. And so it's a euphemism of one taking the path of Torah or executing Torah whenever it is ambiguous. So just like the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, there were many things that were said that were ambiguous that were passed down orally. The reason why we know this, because if you read the Torah, where he said he settled these cases, look as you may to your own exhaustion, and you will not find it written in Torah. They were passed down orally. And then later on in time, by the time we get to the Second Temple, and Israel was in danger of being dispersed throughout the four corners of the earth, which history already has shown us, all right? The sages, the judges of Israel, the wise men of Israel, the Hachamim, decided that we must write these things down. So the Mishnah was created, and the Mishnah was done around the time the so-called Gospels were finally put into writing. That's how old the Mishnah is. Around the 3rd century CE, which is about 260 some odd, the Mishnah was completed. And that was the oral law that was passed down. The Talmud in Bavel, which is Babylon or Iraq, was finally completed, which is the embodiment of the Mishnah and the legends and the exegeses of scriptures and even traditions, minhagim, were all embodied and finished and completed by the 5th century CE. That's the reason why it's called the Babylon Talmud. I've heard some people say, oh, it was the Babylon Talmud because we were expelled in Babylon, that the Talmud existed then. No, the Talmud did not exist. Yes, oral law did, but the Talmud didn't. All right? The Talmud is the embodiment. It's a voluminous work that covers the many subjects of the Mishnah or the oral law. So, the oral law is an ancient text when it's finally written or anthologized and completed by the 3rd century CE. It was the ruling of Israel of the religious court, the Great Sanhedrin, 2,000 years ago. It was not created by Edomites. As a matter of fact, the judges of Israel were so meticulous and they were so careful that when it came down to naming all of the judges of Israel, all the way from the time of Moses, and the last part, when this dismantlement of the Sanhedrin came to be, they were very careful to let us know who were all Israelites and how many of those great court rulers were actually converts. And believe it or not, you can count on one hand how many converts were the heads of the Sanhedrin court. The truth about the Talmud, that it embodies the oral law, the path that we ought to take in executing Torah. It is a heaven mandate. It is commanded by the Most High himself that we must follow the oral law. Now, as far as these other objections, I would be glad to take them. You can write some of your objections down below in your comments, and then we will tackle those objections of Talmud that you may have and put them in perspective. And so, with the help of Hashem, we will make this a series, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it educational, and I hope you find it thought-provoking, and that you will begin your study as we move on in the next series of the Talmud. I'm Rabbi Yehuda, and I bid you all a shalom uvracha. If you're not subscribed, hit the subscribe button and hit the notification button below, and then you will be notified when we come out with our next series.